distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning to all of you. On behalf of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, we would like to warmly welcome each and every one of you to the Festival of Ideas 2019. The theme for the inaugural edition of this festival is Governance for the Future, Asia's Perspective. My name is Aaron, and I'm a Master of International Affairs candidate at the Lee Kuan Yew School. To start us off, it is my pleasure to invite Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics, Professor Danny Kuan, to give his welcoming remarks. Dean, over to you.
Emeritus Senior Minister Goh Chok Tong, Chairman of our Governing Board, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends, and colleagues. Our school, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, shares many features with schools of public policy all around the world. But at the same time, our school is a unique construction. Most obviously, it carries the name of Singapore's founding Prime Minister. For that reason, it attracts untold goodwill, respect, and admiration from all around the world, standards that we constantly seek to live up to. And from Singaporeans here, an appropriate sense of pride and ownership. The school deeply cherishes and values the trust and goodwill from all of the people around us, a generosity that has allowed the school to do so much so quickly. Our school's journey over the last 15 years and continuing ahead is guided by principles, by our founding documents, our constitutional papers, as it were. And the intent in those founding documents makes clear our school's mission. The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy is an international institution that brings together scholars, policy experts, thought leaders from all around the world to share and to study diverse experiences. This community of interest, this fellowship in the classical sense of the word, works because the school engages closely with both government practitioners and other research bodies and higher education institutions. The school continues to become a center of excellence for academic study and research in public policy, focusing on the study of public policy in Asian societies in the first instance, and specifically the economic and social policy challenges in developing, in transitional, and in newly industrialized economies. In this process, the school helps reaffirm how the best practices in Singapore can form a global point of reference for the study of public policy and public management. We think of our mission as a continuing one, being an international institution that convenes on the one hand, and on the other hand, being a center of excellence means we need to achieve the very highest standards of credibility, authority, and trust with our community, our fellowship. This means studying with the highest integrity and rigor the reality of social, political, and economic developments around us. It means our community generating foundational ideas on public policy and management and constantly testing those ideas against the most demanding and rigorous of interrogation in the world of both real-world policy affairs and academic research. It means importantly cherishing our past to glean the best principles, as well as forging ahead on the defining challenges of the future. Continuing to make Singapore a global point of reference for best practice means leveraging a positive sum game, seeing how we lift ourselves in the process of helping others around us. It is against that backdrop that this year the school has put on this gathering, a festival of ideas. It is a festival that showcases how the school goes about its daily business of bringing together scholars and experts in policy and in governance. In the school this week, continuing to reach out to the local and international communities and convening all of us here in our Bukit Timah campus, we reaffirm how best practice in Singapore is indeed a global point of reference, and we subject ourselves and our principles to rigorous investigation by the communities that matter, our Singaporean stakeholders, and our stakeholders in the space of ideas and international affairs more generally. This marketplace of ideas that we are all engaged in is how the best, most enduring principles will emerge. Over the course of this next 4 days, this festival will mount almost 50 sessions. It will put on over 90 hours of content presented and curated by nearly 40 Lee Kuan Yew School participants and scholars and 60 external speakers, with women forming almost, but admittedly not yet, exactly half of all the airtime that we will see. In doing this, we will bring almost 7,000 footfalls to our campus. This is a wonderful and glorious celebration of the best of principles that the school has to offer. And I want to welcome everyone and earnestly wish that you all enjoy yourselves at this festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean Daniqua. To start our next panel discussion, I would like to call upon the moderator, James Crabtree, Associate Professor in Practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, together with Dean Daniqua, Dean and Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Rana Karadsheh-Haddad, Regional Industry Director, Asia Pacific for the International Finance Corporation, and Thomas Friedman, Foreign Affairs columnist at the New York Times. Over to you.
So my name is James Crabtree. I'm an associate professor in practice here at the school. My job here is to say very little. I'm your chairman. We're going to run through until 12 o'clock. And the topic that we're here to discuss is not just one of the big research themes of our school, but one, if not the biggest question that affects any of us who are interested in economics and politics here in Asia and globally, namely the nature of the future direction of globalization. Globalization or de-globalization. What is our future? What does it hold? If you think about it simply, there were three big T's. The first era, the big era of globalization: trade, technology, and travel, people movement. All three of them were seen to be almost unstoppable forces. The transfer of goods, the spread of technology, and the movement of people. All three of them, in their own way, have, since the global financial crisis, either stalled or gone into reverse. Certainly, trade has stagnated. Technology, rather than being an unstoppable force, has become a force of division, particularly between the US and China. And while the statistics say that global people flows continue to rise, the consequences of that in terms of cultural division, backlash, and instability in areas like refugee movement have been considerable. So that's the discussion that we want to have. What is our future, particularly thinking of it here in Singapore, a very globalization-dependent economy? And so to run through that, you've already heard from our Dean, Daniqua, Rana Karachi from the International Finance Corporation, an arm of the World Bank, who spends her life as a manager across the whole of Asia, thinking about how to invest and develop this continent in terms of trade and a whole range of other things. And then Tom Friedman, one of the global gurus of the first wave of globalization. His books, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, The World is Flat, more recently, Thank You for Being Late. I'm sure many of you will have read, and has been a kind of investigator and seer of globalization for many decades now. And so we're going to hear from each of them in turn for 10 minutes apiece. Then I'm going to moderate a discussion between the three of us, and then we'll have time for audience Q&A, some of which I think you've been told that there's an app that you can use to ask questions, and I have an iPad here in front of me, but we also have our traditional old-fashioned microphones for those of you who are more of that bent, and so we'll take a selection from the app and a selection from people who decide to stand up. So that's what we're going to do. Thank you very much for coming. Danny, let me turn over to you for the first opening contribution.
I want to think about globalization as the increasing ease with which everything is available to us, wherever we are on the planet. I take this description from a trade perspective, but obviously it has implications for how we think about technology, the flow of ideas, the flow of financial capital. I want to make 3 points in our discussion of globalization. The first is that globalization is not linear. While it is very helpful to think about the world having more globalization, to think about disruptors like Donald Trump or Brexit pulling the world back, setting up barriers so that the world de-globalizes and there's less globalization, the first point I want to make is that we need to stop thinking about globalization as being something linear. It is not like the nuclear doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. We're closer to midnight, we're further away from midnight. Instead, what I want to argue is that globalization, it is a knotted ball of string, it is hairy in parts, it's all complicated and non-linear. I want to argue in a little bit, as I flesh in the detail on that, what exactly I mean by that. But if for the time being, you're willing to accept my basic hypothesis that globalization is non-linear, 2 important implications follow. The first is, at any given point in time, the supply of globalization on offer in the world does not have to be the same as the demand for globalization from the perspective of any given nation. This is in contrast to the idea that more globalization is always a good thing because more globalization brings more open markets. Instead, my second point is that there is an optimum amount of globalization, and often the empirical reality that we see out there is not where we ought to be. The second implication, just as important, is that because globalization is not linear, because it doesn't mean just greater openness and it's a win-win proposition, that also means globalization is asymmetric. It is differentiated in how it affects different economies. And the critical part of that observation is that we will often encounter situations where globalization pits nation against nation. There's no longer the idea of a clear win-win outcome always. When we look around the world and we appreciate, in light of this proposition, this hypothesis, that globalization is not always win-win, for me, it helps me in a predictive, positive economic sense. It helps me understand why some parts of the world are still all in favor of greater globalization, and other parts of the world seek to pull back. So it is consistent with what we see in the world. My third point is, where do I take these ideas going forwards? What is the future for this globalized world, this appropriately globalized world? And what I will argue there is that we need to step back a bit from the knee-jerk reaction that so many of us have, that a globalized international regime with America at the center pushing for ever more open borders is something that's accepted and indeed welfare improving for everyone. We need to step back from that idea. And in place of the muscle memory that we've got that associates American unipolarity with the best of globalization and multilateralism, we need to think more creatively, in a more subtle way, in a more nuanced way. Where I'm going to land is that in the world today, recognizing this complicated, nonlinear nature of globalization, we need to think about schemes that work. We need to think about how nations can help other nations get past their difficulties with globalization. In other words, we think about how nations can help themselves to the fruits of globalization by actually helping others through the difficulties that they face. So these are the 3 points I want to make. In the time that I've got, let me just flesh out a little bit of each of these. Why do I say globalization is nonlinear? Why do I say it's hairy, it's matted, it's knotty, it's all different convolutions? Because after all, doesn't economics tell us that the greater volume of trade that you've got, the better it is? And indeed, in many circumstances, that's absolutely right. Greater openness flattens social hierarchies. It opens up the people in my society to exposure to the best ideas in the world. It sparks creativity. It helps us all become better versions of ourselves. It improves the availability of intermediate inputs. It makes producers more efficient. It improves the variety, lowers the price of final goods. It makes consumers better off. There's nothing to object to that. Let me suggest, however, that there are many things in the real world where greater openness doesn't bring just that. We have the idea that global competition reduces the power of local feudal landlords, local government monopolies, local cronies. But we don't often recognize that greater openness introduces yet other vested interests. Multinational banks, large corporations, winner-take-all network externality-driven big tech companies. All of these things will worsen social hierarchies. All of these things will exacerbate income inequality. All of these things create, in turn, a local political economy where more globalization doesn't mean necessarily good things. So yes, globalization brings good things, but it also brings difficulties. One huge difficulty for many emerging economies is something called trade-related intellectual property rights, TRIPS. Intellectual property systems are meant to be schemes that help societies navigate the difficulty, the trade-off between the creativity of their inventors and the efficiency of the marketplace. But ever since 2004, we have fetishized TRIPS into trade agreements. We have declared how trade agreements that don't carry TRIPS are not gold standard high quality. RCEP often comes criticized for this, as against what TRIPS would have done under TPP. Well, actually, in economic theory and in history, TRIPS, intellectual property, is different from ordinary goods and services. And the act of commercializing and marketizing them in the current version of globalization actually harms societies. Okay. There's a laundry list of yet other things we can go through. Let me leave my first point at that. Globalization is not linear. There's not more globalization, less globalization. There's the right kind of globalization. And the right kind of globalization is what works differently for different nations. And very quickly on the heels of that follow my two propositions. First, that there's an optimum of globalization. It's not always what the world has to offer each individual society, but we need to do what's best for ourselves. And at the same time, we need to understand that there emerges conflict. The clearest example of that is when China and India's globalization put onto global labor markets 2 billion additional workers at low wages. Just the force of market competition, never mind terms like Heckscher-Ohlin theory or factor price equalization theorem, just the force of market competition means that the lower income, lower wage, and high income societies will all of a sudden face great competition. Force of market competition drives wages down at the low end in rich countries, drives wages up everywhere in the emerging countries. Emerging countries greatly value globalization. America, Britain, and elsewhere are tortured, are nuanced in how they view this, and that sets up the tension. So what do we do going forwards? And this is my concluding third point. We need to step back from the easy policy advice that say more globalization is always good, open up your economy. Instead, think about what the right kind of globalization is. And when yours is a society that values globalization, but those around you do not, try and think about the game whereby helping others around you see past those challenges, help them on income inequality, help them build infrastructure. You can bring everyone up, and in doing so, you yourself benefit from globalization. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Danny. So we're going to go down the panel in order to make things simple. So, Rana, do you want to give us your sort of starter for 10?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James. And it's really a pleasure to come after Professor Danny Kuan. I think I've really appreciated your comments. Let me just first give everybody in the audience, because everybody may not be familiar with what we do at IFC. IFC is what we call the private sector investing arm of the World Bank Group. We were established in 1956 with the idea being that really to have sustained economic development, you need to have a vibrant private sector. So IFC was set up to help sort of emerging economies develop by investing directly into the private sector. And it's been quite a successful story. And just to give you kind of an overview of our size, scale, and reach, kind of put into context, and then I can share what I do, and then from that, the perspective that I bring into this conversation as well. We invest anywhere between 15 to 20 billion every year globally, only in emerging markets. Last year, we deployed about 19 billion across the globe. We have a portfolio size of about 60 billion in 2,000 companies. And like I said, our ultimate objective is how do we have economic development, right? And we have to track that for every investment that we do. So to give you a flavor of some of the indicators that we have seen, and of course this is going to be linked to what the perspective that I'll introduce in terms of globalization and how we look at it and how we see it impacting our clients, our economies, our work, and why we feel it's important and where the challenges are. But last year, for example, from our investments, we created about 2.1 million jobs, provided about 50 million in microfinance loans, about 8 million in SME loans. We reached about 50 million patients, over 5 million farmers reached through our financing, 18 million people reached through increased access to water, and about 81 million people reached through increased power generation. So for us, this is very much part and parcel of what we do. And one of the things that we are seeing is as people are deploying capital, they're looking at saying, as we talk to other financial institutions, and they're deploying capital around the globe, is how do we measure it and how do we ensure that it has impact, right? And so recently we've launched these what we call these impact principles for sustainable investing. And I'm happy to say that about 70 institutions have signed up to that. So it shows you that there's an increased awareness of capital, institutional capital, that wants to be deployed globally, I would argue, but with impact. Right? And so this is a trend that we are certainly seeing, and for us, it's a very positive thing. Now, going back to sort of the theme on globalization and de-globalization, right? So we have seen global growth global growth has slowed, is expected to slow this year. So if we look at the global numbers, according to the World Bank, it'll decrease from 3% to 2.5% in 2019 from 2018. Asia, also a slight decline, 6.5% to 6%, right? So the World Bank recently launched, and sort of directly related to this, recently launched what we call the Global Value Chain Report 2020. Right? And it looks across the globe at sort of the cross-country production process, specialization, hyper-specialization, and it talks about how that has net benefited population, but sort of where that trend has been moving and why it's moved as such. And as one of the sort of multilateral institutions, we like to think of ourselves as trying to enhance the betterment of global economies by enhancing trade and economic flows. Does that mean I'm below 5 minutes? Sorry.
No. You've got 5 to go.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So just as a point of reference, in 1970, about 37%, there was a 37% of global value trade existed. That increased to 2005 to 52%. 52% of global value trade, right, we saw in 2008. And then there was a subsequent decline, what we found, to about 48% currently, right? So there's been a slight decline. And what's been happening as a result of that decline, right? So we see shifts, right? China has been, which was a big driver of international trade, has been looking more internally, right, at servicing their local economy, focusing on domestic consumption, right? Commodity trade, which was a big part of that, right, has slowed down, obviously because the U.S. has shale gas reserves, right? So they've been, haven't been trading as much in sort of an oil and gas, right? And of course, we see trade reforms, right? Sort of policy maturation and sort of trade reforms. People sort of starting to look more inwards as a result. And why does that matter, right? So as I go back to our objectives, sort of why, what do we look for as part of the World Bank? What is IFC interested in, right? We're looking at how can we deploy capital to enhance economic development. And so while we realize shifts, right, for various reasons, because of shifts in national economies, because shifts in commodity trades, shifts in sort of policy perspectives, right? But we also can see a direct impact as a result of a reduced link in global value trades, reduced link in trade, reduced link in globalization, right? If we see a continued decline, according to the World Bank, there's a risk that an additional 30 million people could be pushed into poverty, right? And global income could decline by 1.4 trillion. Hardest hit in this, biggest beneficiaries of global trade are women in the workforce. Hardest hit from de-globalization, we find, will be the women in the workforce, right? So I think these are things to sort of keep in mind that are important. We see a number of different risks to global growth and trade going forward. Obviously, the shift in China's economy, right? Shifts in global financial conditions, right? High household and corporate debt increasing, geopolitical tensions, and overlaying all of this, of course, will be climate, right? Climate and technology certainly can just continue to disrupt, businesses' economic cycles. And I have a lot of other points that I want to bring, but let me just sort of conclude on one thing. Since we're here at the university, and I think Professor Danny Kuan is right, sort of globalization is not linear, right? And I'm curious, how many people in this audience have familiar with the term VUCA? Have you ever heard about a VUCA world, right? Volatile, uncertain, confusing, ambiguous, right? And I think sort of, since we're here at the university talking to, I'm sure, a number of students here, I guess comments I would make to you is that, and points of advice I would make to the students in the audience is that you have to constantly think about how you retool yourself. I think there was a McKinsey report that came out that says we have to sort of retool ourselves every 5 years, right? And I think that's going to continue to accelerate, right? And it's going to accelerate because of all the disruptions between globalization, de-globalization. I think we're going to constantly see a world of disruption. And I think that, what's going to be important for us as part of the global economy going forward will be sort of how do you connect the dots, right? How do you work globally? How do you, bring in and constantly reinvent and retool yourself? And how do you work in a world of disruption? And so there's no clear answer, but I think, what is clear is that we need to constantly being able to do that, right? So in sort of the generation where I grew up at work, my boss will tell me to do something, I'll say, sure, I'll do it. Now I'll tell somebody maybe with the younger generation, can you do something? And they'll ask why, right? So I think we constantly, and I think how Professor Danny Kuan, started his talk, was that we need to constantly be questioning ourselves. And so I would encourage all of you to continue to do that. Thank you.
Super. Thank you. All right, age of disruption. This brings us neatly onto you, Tom, or age of acceleration, as you now call it. Do you want to give us your sense of where your thinking on globalization has reached?
Yeah, well, thank you, James. Those were great. I've been taking notes. So when I wrote The World is Flat, back in 2004, maybe just start there. But what I meant by the term flat, because it got widely misinterpreted by different people who wanted it to mean different things than I did. And what I meant was simply not that the world was equal. What I meant was that we had created a technology platform where more people from more places could compete, connect, and collaborate on more things in more ways, on more days, for less money, more equally than ever before. That's what I meant by the world is flat. We'd created a technology platform for that to happen that gave more people the ability to compete, connect, and collaborate on more things. What they did on that platform, though, I got widely branded as the guru of globalization. You name it, I was at. Because the greatest sin you can ever commit as a journalist is to be optimistic about anything, okay? And because I saw a platform emerging that brought more people out of poverty faster than any engine ever created before in history, and that kind of floated my boat, I got a lot of blowback on that, including people who said, oh, Friedman went to India and talked to his high-tech pals in Bangalore and declared the world is flat. Well, actually, not exactly. What actually excited me, the charge said, I didn't understand that there were poor people in India. To which I said, oh, thank you. I hadn't noticed. What you haven't noticed is this. For the first time, we are spawning massive numbers of Indian engines, entrepreneurs, and innovators who are making India unpoor. And that is new, and that is important. And I make no apologies for giving that a standing ovation. So that's sort of where I was kind of coming from. Now this platform, though, because I believe globalization is a platform, it goes both ways. And it's everything and its opposite. It can be incredibly democratizing and incredibly authoritarian. It can be incredibly particularizing and incredibly homogenizing. It can be wonderful for individuals and terrible for individuals. It's all about the values that we bring to this platform. And that's a question of politics and society. The other thing I noticed is that globalization began to be blamed for everything, including massive job loss. And I tried to point out to people that the engine of job loss is actually technology acceleration. We used to have a receptionist at the New York Times Bureau in Washington, D.C. We don't anymore. But she didn't lose her job to a Mexican. She lost her job to a microchip. We got voicemail, okay? But because you can't see the microchip, but you can see the Mexican, we tended to blame individuals and globalization for what was largely driven by technology. But that's not to suggest what both Ron and Danny pointed out, that for certain sectors of society, at a certain time, the surge of trade from China had a devastating impact. And that's why politics has to be about cushioning the worst impacts and enhancing the best. And that's why I like so much what Danny said. My way of saying what he said is, I'm all for floors, but I'm really against walls. That I think the way to manage globalization is by trying to lift the floor for everyone, not by erecting walls. Because I've been accused of being a technological determinist, and I am guilty as charged. By that I mean, I believe if I have a cell phone that allows me at zero marginal cost to have collaborators around the world, customers around the world, suppliers around the world, I'm going to use this, okay? What I use it for, though, is a whole nother question, which is why the question of values and ethics today becomes much more important. Because we now live in a world where more people, because of globalization, can do unto you. Putin did unto us in our election, and you can do unto others more deeply than ever before. So where is globalization today? Because I tend to look at it as globalization was initially driven by countries. Spain, launching Christopher Columbus to the New World. Then it was driven primarily by companies, the Dutch East India Company. Today, I believe globalization is driven primarily by individuals because of the technology is now allowing individuals to compete, connect, and collaborate globally as individuals. And so I'm really, I totally agree with what Ron said, that if you actually think about globalization as containers on ships and planes, it's actually flat to declining. Mm-hmm. If you think of globalization as I do, which is digital globalization, where everything is being digitized and globalized through Facebook, Twitter, MOOCs, and Internet of Things, it's actually accelerating and looks like a giant hockey stick by any indices of global cell phone diffusion, global internet use, et cetera. It's really digital globalization is the new thing that came along since I began writing about this in 2004, and it is rapidly accelerating. So why is that? So I tend to look at technology as moving up in steps, and each step tends to be driven by a bias toward a certain set of capabilities, biased by a dominant set of technologies. And I would argue that around 2000, a set of technologies came together that were biased toward connectivity. And that was because the dot-com boom, bubble, and bust collapsed the price of fiber optic cable. And so we accidentally wired the world. Honey, I didn't mean to, but I shrunk the world, okay? And we in America discovered that around Y2K. We discovered that we need to remediate all our computers because when the calendar turns to 2000, they're all going to blow up and the electricity is going to stop and the water won't come out your faucet and all these other things we are warned of. And the process of remediating all these computers required massive numbers of engineers. And we discovered that we had accidentally wired the world, so we actually leveraged engineers in Bangalore, India, in the tens of thousands to help us remediate this problem. So because connectivity had become fast, virtually free, easy for you, and invisible, and ubiquitous. And I discovered it by calling home to Minneapolis one day and talking to my mom and her telling me around 2000 that I was interrupting her because she was playing bridge on the internet with someone in Siberia, okay? And so whenever people tell me, oh, the globalization, we've seen all that before, I say, really? Was your great-grandmother playing bridge on the internet with someone in Siberia? So don't let anyone tell you there's nothing new here, okay? Because the ability of an individual to act globally now is fundamentally new. So in what happened around 2000, around that step, was that suddenly I could touch people who I could never touch before. And I could be touched by people who could never touch me before. And I came along and gave that moment a name. I said, it feels like the world is flat. But as Danny and Rodney said, this is a dynamic process. It didn't just stop there. Technology moved up another step. Around 2000, another set of technologies came together. And they were biased toward complexity. They were driven by another price collapse, a collapse in the price of compute and storage. And what that allowed, with the right algorithms, was for us to massively abstract complexity in more and more ways of our daily life and commerce. We could suddenly take sand out of the gears of so many things and put grease in their place. And the world became fast. That's because around the year 2000, a set of technologies came together around compute, storage, memory, and software that gave us the ability to connect mobility, broadband, cloud in ways that were utterly transformative. In 2007, the iPhone came out. January 11th, Steve Jobs. In 2007, Facebook opened its platform to anyone with a registered email address. In 2007, Twitter launched its own independent platform. In 2007, Hadoop, which created big data, was launched into the wild. In 2007, GitHub was launched, the world's largest repository of open source software. In 2007, VMware went public, which created the foundation of cloud computing, enabled any operating system to work with any computer. In 2007, Android was launched. In 2007, Google bought a little-known TV company called YouTube. In 2007, Netflix streamed its first video. Lyft sent its first rider. Watson, IBM's Watson, was launched in the computer world, the first cognitive computer. The essay around Bitcoin was launched late 2006. Airbnb was launched in 2007. I can go down the list. 2007, I believe, will go down in history as one of the single greatest technological inflection points in history, and we completely missed it because of 2008. Yeah, right when our technologies massively accelerated, our social technologies, the learning reform, education reform, management reform, and governing reform you would need with such an acceleration in technology completely froze because we entered the deepest recession since 1929. And in that gap between what happened to our physical technologies and what didn't happen to our social, educational, and governing technologies, a huge number of Brexit and Trump voters were born because a huge number of people got completely dislocated. But again, as my colleague said, the process is dynamic. It just kept going. And we leapt up to a third step around 2015. This step was driven by a further price collapse in the powers of compute, storage, and memory, and much stronger algorithms which gave us artificial intelligence, and a collapse in the price of sensors, which allowed us to deploy sensors everywhere, on every light, faucet, drain, computer, engine. We could put sensors and create this Internet of Things everywhere, and then digitize all that data and store it in the cloud. And the world became smart. Suddenly we could put intelligence into everything. Suddenly now with no touch, sorry, I didn't say in the second stage, it was all about what we could do with one touch. With one touch, I could page a taxi, direct a taxi, pay a taxi, rate a taxi, and be rated by a taxi. With one little touch. Because we had abstracted away all that complexity. We had made complexity fast, free, easy for you, and invisible, and the world got fast. In this third stage, the world got smart. Now with no touch. On my phone this morning, it says you're on a panel with James Crabtree in 45 minutes, and you're 50 minutes away. It didn't say moron, you're 15 minutes away, but that will come, okay? So that was with no touch. It sensed where James was, where I was, and with no touch, pushed intelligence to me. So basically what's happened with the technology underlying globalization is in the last 2 decades, the world went from flat to fast to smart. So again, it never stopped. The process is dynamic because it's driven by technology, okay? So where are we today? So where are we today is that my wife is building a word language museum in Washington, D.C. It's called Planet Word, world's first word language museum. She's a real wordie, and she likes to come back at the end of every year and ask me if I know what the word of the year is, because the online dictionaries can now track what is the most searched word. What word did more people around the world look up last year? And on Webster's Merriman, they will tell you that in 2018, the word of the year was justice. More people looked up the meaning of justice in 2018 than any other word. So I told my wife, you can close the contest for 2019 now. I will tell you what the word of the year is, okay? And the word of the year for 2019 is deep. Deep. Have you noticed how we're applying the adjective deep to everything? Deep fake, deep surveillance, deep state, deep mind, deep research, deep medicine, deep war, deep climate. And by the way, no one declared this. No one declared this the word of the year. No one declared we must call it, but everyone autonomously, independently, has started to apply the word deep. Because when the world goes from fast to flat to smart, it starts to go really deep. Suddenly, I can hit, as a medical researcher, I can hit that cell. I can toggle that DNA at a depth of precision that was science fiction just 5 years ago. Suddenly, as a war maker, I can hit a target. I can kill you and your wife upstairs and leave your kids alone downstairs. Suddenly, as a researcher, I can find the needle in the haystack of my data at a depth of precision that was unimaginable. And because we all intuit now, we're going to a depth we've never been at before. We all suddenly started describing this as deep because we knew we were somewhere we hadn't been before. And because I'm a big believer in following popular culture, I get a lot of my signals from there. You may have noticed the song that won the Oscars last year by Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper was called Shallow, okay? But listen to the words. I'm off the deep end, watch as I dive in. I'll never see the shore, crash through the surface where they can't hurt us. We're far from the shallow now. Oh, baby, we are far from the shallow now. Okay. So basically, the world has gone from flat to fast to smart to deep. Now, why does this impact globalization? Well, take the US-China trade issue. There are two issues in that story today. There's soybeans and Boeings, and one way or another, they'll figure that out. They'll buy more soybeans, they'll buy more Boeing, whatever it is, we'll figure that out. But the other issue is called Huawei. And Huawei is the apotheosis of the deep problem. It is the tip of a gigantic iceberg that I believe represents the biggest challenge to globalization today. And that is because for 30 years, China sold us shallow goods. They sold us shirts we wore on our back. They sold us shoes we wore on our feet. They sold us shocks that we wore on our ankles. They sold us surface goods, solar panels that we put on our roofs. They sold us toys, t-shirts, and tennis shoes. But China has become a technological powerhouse now, and it now wants to sell us Huawei 5G, and Huawei 5G is deep. It gets buried in your sidewalk, in the walls of your house, in the bot in your bedroom. And we and China do not have a trust framework for us to buy their deep goods. And that is the core of the story today with the US and China. They had to buy our deep goods for 30 years, our software, our computers. They didn't have a choice. But now that they can also make deep technologies, we have a choice, or think we do. And without a trust and shared values framework, US-China trade cannot go forward because we don't have a framework to buy their deep goods. So one of two things is going to happen. Either we're going to collaboratively develop that framework, in which case you are going to see globalization on steroids. Oh, you are going to see globalization like we've never seen it before. Or we're not going to develop that framework. And if we don't, we're going to look back on the past 30 years of globalization as the great and wonderful good old days. Thank you.
I'm almost tempted to ask Tom to give us a full rendition of the song. Let me ask you a quick question. So, Tom, you said, you're seen as this high priest of globalization. There was a time in the 1990s, around the time, so when the Lexus and the olive tree came out, when Blair and Clinton, these sort of leaders were in power, globalization was seen as unstoppable, and not the globalization you're talking about, but what you call your grandfather's globalization, containers on ships, trade going around the world. Now, what did we get wrong about that? Because it does seem to have been much more stoppable than maybe you think. I don't know if you will admit a mea culpa here. I mean, did you get that wrong a bit, or?
Well, I really don't think so, because that book, one of the biggest chapters in that book was called "The Backlash Against Globalization." It was all about Seattle. So what was the framework of that book? That book came along in a context where 1989 just happened, so we'd entered the post-Cold War world. And the book was written in the context of everyone was trying to ask, because the Cold War was a system of understanding international relations. So if the Cold War had collapsed, what is the new system for framework for understanding global international affairs? And I would argue, well, there were three very prominent books that came out. The first was by Frank Fukuyama. He said the system that will replace the Cold War system will be the triumph of free markets and free people everywhere. And that will be the end of history. That didn't work out. The second big argument was by Sam Huntington. He said what's going to replace the Cold War system is actually going to be a clash of civilizations. Well, actually what's happened is much more clash within civilizations, Sunnis and Shiites, much more than, as one example, Koreans and Chinese or Japanese, much more than actually a giant clash of civilizations. The third was Robert Kaplan. He said it's going to actually be the coming anarchy. And my book was written in that context. And what I argued was that actually what's going to replace the Cold War system is an interaction between what I call the Lexus and the olive tree, between all these very old and ancient urges and aspirations within us around identity, place, region, sect, tribe, and faith, are olive tree urges that are always there and can easily emerge into the world. And they will be intersecting with something very new, this globalization system. And the story will be about the interaction between the two. So yes, Vladimir Putin will seize Crimea. He'll seize Crimea. His olive tree urges will drive him to do that. But he won't go to Kiev. Why won't he go to Kiev? Because the globalization system and the IFC will so punish him for doing that he won't dare do that. Instead, he'll use just little green men to try to destabilize. So everywhere I look, I think that framework today is still alive and well. And I argued that what was new about this form of international relations, just to close, was that we now will not just have superpowers, but we will have super empowered individuals. And some will do amazing things. Mark Zuckerberg will create a platform that 2.4 billion people will use today. And I said, but unfortunately, we'll also have super empowered angry men and women. And I wrote this book in 1998, it came out in 99. And my example of the super empowered angry man was a guy who was called Osama bin Laden. So I probably got a few things wrong there. I think I got a few things right also about sort of what was happening. And I would argue that of those four frameworks, James, I think I'm still standing. I didn't get everything right. There's been a pushback on the neoliberal golden straitjacket, whatnot. But when I get that pushback, I always say, I totally get it. What is your alternative? What is the alternative economic engine that will create this much prosperity for this many people? And I think that's really what the debate should be about. So that's my reaction.
So Rana, let me sort of ask a variant of the same question to you. So I struck at the end that you said the people who will lose out most from a world of deglobalization are often the poorest. You mentioned women. I mean, give us so you were talking about global value chains and who benefits from them and what the risks are. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe give us a practical example? But also, I mean, is it your sense that institutions like the IFC and the World Bank, which to some degree were accused of being very favorable towards globalization, have now got a kind of more nuanced view about the way forward?
Okay. Let me see if I can be as inspirational as Tom Friedman, but I'll try to give it a shot. From so there's a couple of questions in there, and let me see if I can approach from a couple of different perspectives. So one, let me just say, the way we've looked at, I think there's no increase since China joined the WTO in 1990, and I think, as Professor Kuan mentioned, a huge influx into the labor force at that point sort of disrupted how things were. But since then, I think everyone probably agrees that there's been a general global economic sort of positive output. Globally, we have net benefited from global trade. Has it been disproportionate? Yes, right? So even looking at the United States, you can see probably coasts have benefited much more than the heartland of America, and you're seeing it playing out in current politics today. You add to it sort of fast and deep, you further disrupt that, right? But just looking at it from that simple lens of sort of global economic trade and sort of benefits. The impetus, in my mind, then comes back to sort of what is the role of the government and what do they play in this picture? And how do they help sort of soften those impacts, right? So there's a lot of policy sort of things that they can do at their disposal to help sort of, manage that transition, whether it's retool the labor force, whether it's, investing in infrastructure or other ways. But there, you cannot let trade in and of itself move. I mean, I think governments do certainly have a role to play in that. How we look at that, so let me just share a couple of things. So the areas that the team that I work with cover, so I cover all of Asia, East Asia, South Asia, so 32 countries where we invest. It's a massive area, right? So last year, so I oversee a portfolio of $5 billion. Last year we put in about $1.5 billion across Asia. And we're constantly looking at ways how we can deploy capital to enhance economic activity, right? One of the areas that we look at would be agribusiness. So if we, specifically to answer your question, James, sort of what is one impact? So let me give you a couple of numbers here, right? So between now and 2030, we expect the demand for food to grow by 50% between now and 2030, right? Because of rising median incomes, because of growing population, urbanization, number of different reasons, right? The demand for food will go by 50%. However, the arable land that can be used, we only have about 25% more. So how do we square that equation, right? Does that mean some people go hungry, right? So that's where I go to see direct impacts of, parking technology aside, which I fully agree has created globalization at the individual level. But going back to sort of the bricks and mortar of enabling, people to get out of poverty, right? Global value chains, trade, globalization is very much embedded into the global food value chain, right? And the only way you can square that 50% growth for demand for food with only 25% of increased arable land availability is one, through trade. But two, that's where technology comes in, right? Enhanced technology can increase productivity of the farmland that you're using now, right? And of course, these new, like, no meat or never meat, I can't know what it's called, but sort of new ways of introducing protein into the population. I've talked to some people now who are investing in bugs, saying that's the future of protein and bugs. I'm not sure I'm fully there yet, but I know one of those guys, yeah. I'm not sure I do, but it does impact in terms of what we see and how we see sort of people coming and trying to lift them out of poverty. Food is essential. If I can talk sort of about the impact on sort of globalization, just infrastructure, let me talk a little bit about that. There's a lot of infrastructure that's being deployed around Asia, led by, for example, BRI, right? It's deploying capital around the globe. It's enhancing increased trade, right? But there's one thing that we are seeing, at least I would see as a financial investor, as I look at that, one cautionary word is, right? So for example, just like pointing to China, for example. China has been deploying a lot of capital in infrastructure in many countries, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Kazakhstan, wherever. The thing is, just to keep in mind, it's not part of the international agreement, going back to the comment about sort of international, multilaterals, international agreement in terms of how countries look at addressing and restructuring debt. Because I can tell you, some of those loans will go bad, for sure. Some of those loans will go bad. And right now, there's no protocol in place to say, how do we work through them? Because China's doing many of this on its own, not part of the international agreement. How they're going to work through these, we don't know, right? What will be the result and what further disruption that will cause. So all of these things, I would say, trade is good for us. We have to look at it differently. We do look at it as to how can we help a country enhance its competitiveness and its self-dependency as much as possible, but understanding that there's limitation, and at some point you've got to have trade, right? To bring in food, to bring in goods, to bring in raw material, right? So that will create disruption, and we see that will certainly happen. There were a few statistics that I shared, but some of this stuff is unknown, right? And so as we look, so this year, as we look at how we're going to deploy our capital across Asia, these are some of the things that we look at. We're looking at what's happening in China. We're looking at what's happening economically in India now, saying, okay, so where can we put our capital to help shore up the private investor, the private sector, so that it doesn't collapse, so that they don't have too much strain on their balance sheet, so they can continue to hire people, so they can continue to create productivity in the economy. So a lot of different thoughts in answer to that question, but I think a lot of serious global implications as well.
Great, thank you so much. Danny, one short question, one longer question. The short question is, so in your opening remarks, you posited this idea that there's a sort of optimum level of globalization, and so we shouldn't think always more is better. So that begs the question, sort of where are we at the moment? About right? Not enough? A little bit more needed? What's your sense?
So that's the long question.
That's the short one. The longer one is about China. We'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
So.
Yes. I think, depending on which country we're at, obviously for the U.S. has festered over the last, its political conversation has festered on a number of sore points. The immiserization of the poor in the United States. In most other countries, inequality has risen. We accept that that's part of what dealing with the rest of the world means. But it's really only the United States where the bottom 50% have seen an actual decline in the absolute levels of their income. Nowhere else. I suspect that we cannot look at the US and say, yeah, this is kind of working for America. It's not. Something needs to be done there. But obviously for a nation like China, Tom, you've referred to how hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. China is the epitome of that, 627 million. From the bags of nothing but exporting to the rest of the world, low-value, shallow things lifted themselves out of poverty. So as we take a tour of the world, I suspect that nations are going to line up on different points of those two extremes. Right. But there isn't one fit answer to all of that.
So both Rana and Tom mentioned China, and I'll bring you in on this in a minute. But so you said, in a sense, we all have to ditch this image that globalization was driven by the United States. It's going to be different and more complicated, but it brings China into mind. We have a question here from our audience. You can send me questions. So Eric asks, Eric Chang, China, it's apparent that Beijing participates in the international rule-based order when it's in their favor, but not when it isn't. And so in a sense, are you optimistic about,
yeah,
my goodness, what's going on here? Somebody just hit that. But anyway, ignore this. Are you optimistic about a model of globalization that is less American and more Chinese?
The quick answer is yes, because I can see how structures are emerging that are going to allow that to happen. But let me just quickly take on that question directly as well. There is no nation in the world that will agree to do something that is not in their own interest. No nation. No nation ever does that. China is accused of just participating when it suits and pulling back when it doesn't is a description that would apply regardless of which nation we're talking about. Okay, I see we're more distracted by...
Sorry about that. I didn't realize when I went to the questions that this would happen behind me. So
actually, since we're on China, can I press a bit on some of the things that this panel has said? I think there's a narrative that says that the U.S.-China conflict, just to pick up on that, to be very concrete, is, yes, part of the narrative is that it's about a divergence in values. Part of it is about good old-fashioned needing to be number one. Yeah. For whatever deeper reason. It's not really necessarily very well articulated or well understood.
But it's there.
And in fact, if we take that scenario, then it could well be, as part of my answer to James, or how the future global order looks like. America has, for a large part of its life, been extremely autarkic. Right after the end of the Civil War, it viewed itself as out of step with the rest of the world. Its record on human rights was actually spotted relative to that in Europe. It viewed mercantilism as the way to go. It couldn't compete with the rest of the world. It was very happy being autarkic. And it took from 1865 until 1945 before it fully came into the world. So I don't discount the possibility that an extreme bifurcation could occur. It would actually be consistent with that part of history. I wish it didn't, but I'm willing to accept that it would. And so on that point, maybe I might push back a little bit, Tom, on the idea that it is values that separate, that if we see a convergence in values, we could forget the needing to be number one part of the narrative, and we could actually come together. And part of my worry about this is that there are some values for which two sides will never agree. The centrality of the individual versus that of society. The trade-off between individual rights, freedom of expression, and social stability. But the areas where they come into contact on Huawei and on technology, it seems to me the two nations aren't necessarily that far apart. And it's true that, you know, the great worry about Huawei is that the government, the Chinese government, will come in and use up all the security data that come through. But America also has Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Amendment of 2008 that already gives the National Security Agency the right to all the data of non-citizens that flow through big tech companies and America's internet pipes. So the two nations are actually quite comparable in terms of their views on security and the use of internet information hardware. It seems to me that there is a convergence, but that convergence is not in the space of values, but in the space of actually meeting to say how we can use these data, because their approach to these are already quite comparable, it seems.
It's a very good point.
I mean, do you want to come back on that? I mean, say a little bit more about your view of US-China. So you had the view that the engine of the high period of globalization, let's say from the 1990s through to the financial crisis, was a positive US-China relationship. Now we have a less positive relationship. So say a little bit more about how you see that in the future, Tom.
I'll put it in the context of the current news, just to dive in, you know, sort of the whole Trump question, because I've broadly, but at a very high, you know, level of abstraction, supported President Trump on the China question. My view is Donald Trump is not the American president that America deserves, but he is the American president that China deserves. And and why do I feel that? I feel that because if you look at how China grew from poverty to middle income in the last 30 years, I would argue is a three-silo strategy. And I'm very interested in your reaction to this and pushback from this from my perspective. One silo, I think the most important was actually hard work, delayed gratification, a kind of national pulling together around a great mission of smart investments in infrastructure and smart investments in education. And I think that was the prime engine, but it was a very important one, and we tend to underplay that. But there was a second silo. The second silo was stealing other people's intellectual property, forced technology transfer, non-reciprocal trade arrangements, and non-compliance with certain WTO rulings. The third silo, which tends to be completely overlooked, was the US Pacific Fleet, because the presence of our fleet in Asia allowed China to economically dominate all its neighbors without them fearing they would be geopolitically dominated. And that created a huge opportunity for China to expand its kind of globalization initiative regionally. China used that three-silo strategy to grow from poverty to middle income by making shallow goods. If we were to let China, we America, use that same strategy to make artificial intelligence, supercomputers, and microchips, we'd be crazy. So in that sense, I thought there needed to be a rebalancing. Unfortunately, the agent of that rebalancing was Donald Trump. And so on the one hand, he's the only one who had actually done what he did. Unfortunately, he's also the only one who would have done it the way he did it. Okay, and to me, the right way to do that was actually for America to sign TPP, to bring 40% of global GDP on a platform of shared values on right is the right way to do this. Then I would have gone to the Europeans and said to them, well, you have the exact same problem with China that we have. Please join us in this alliance. Then we'd have about 70% of global GDP around our side on what are the fair and right values for trade going into the 21st century. And then I would have gone to China and said, you send your top 4 trade negotiators to Hainan Island, we'll send our top 4. We're going to do all of this in secret. Now in private, I'm coming with all my friends and we are going to absolutely nail you. But in public, we're going to come out and say everybody was a winner. Everybody was a winner and no one lost any face. Instead, Donald Trump made this about him and Xi Jinping and who's got the biggest tariff. Okay? And as a result, it became a huge ego kind of thing, among others, and when it should have been America against the world on what are the right trade values for the 21st century. Had we approached it that way, we would have actually leveraged all the economic reformers in China who actually want to go down that route, and instead we forced all of them to basically wave the nationalist flag And so you actually see Trump doing the exact same thing with Iran. So Trump basically decided, I'm going to take on two of the world's oldest civilizations at the same time, Persia and China, okay? Yeah. And in both cases, he created enormous leverage in both, one with tariffs and one with oil sanctions. But because of the way he does things, he makes it always about him, me versus the other leader, not me on these values. So he forced all the Iranian reformers to have to rally around the national flag as well. And we get stymied. We get less than optimal in both places.
So I like the audience priorities here. So you can see now that rather noisy interlude, which questions you want asked. So I'll ask Rana in a minute about climate, because you mentioned that. But Tom, a little bit further down the list, I have a very blunt question from Niloy Mukherjee. Mr. Friedman, are we going to have another 4 years of Donald Trump, and what impact will that have on globalization? So let's do, since you're talking about the great man, what's your outlook?
So I believe that there are two overwhelming sort of political truths about America today. I believe one is that a majority of Americans, and I can substantiate this with this morning's polls on Real Clear Politics, a majority of Americans want to fire Donald Trump as president. And the other truth is a majority of Americans don't agree on a candidate to replace Donald Trump. So those are the competing truths right now about America. And so the question is, as we go forward, will the Democrats be able to agree on a candidate who can unite the left wing and the right wing of the party, who can bridge Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren with Buttigieg and Biden and Klobuchar and maybe even a Bloomberg. I'm not sure yet he's going to run actually in the end. But whatever it is. And I just don't know, but that's the whole question. You can't beat something with nothing. At the core of the whole thing is a very simple, I would say, math problem. Donald Trump won in 2016 because he managed to persuade 100,000 voters across of course, 3 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. He managed to get independents, moderate Republicans, and suburban women, just enough of them to vote in the end for him over Hillary Clinton. They thought, let's try something new. I don't really like Mrs. Clinton, they said, and how bad can Trump be? Okay? Well, we discovered that. And so what happened in the 2018 midterm elections was the Democrats got these suburban women, moderate Republicans, and independents, 3 out of 4 of them to leave Trump and vote for the Democratic candidates, and that's how the Democrats retook the House. So at its very core, there's really only one question for 2020. Can the Democrats produce a candidate who can keep those suburban women, moderate Republicans, and independents in the Democratic column? And what you have to say about the recent elections in Virginia, Kentucky for governor, and Louisiana for governor, the last 2 being deep red states where Trump campaigned vigorously for the governor, and he lost in all 3, is that the public is ripe for an alternative. I believe that there is still a civic pulse in America, but we are we're a country that's deeply divided right now, and I've never been more worried about America. I've never been more worried about America, not because we haven't been divided before, Lord knows we have, but we're having an uncivil war right now. And we are deeply divided around the 2 things that are the seminal foundation of any democracy, truth and trust. Without truth and trust, you cannot have a democracy. Without shared truth, what are the facts here? And without shared trust, how do we come together to mobilize those facts to the greater good? You really can't go anywhere. And right now, I believe the Republican Party has, our conservative party, is completely off the rails. And it's caught up in conspiracy theories. It's caught up in a cult of personality. It has nothing to do with the conservative movement. And it's in a dangerous place, and 4 more years of it. We can get through 4 years, but we can't get through 4 more without serious damage to our institutions. I just close by saying that I am a Wednesday columnist for the New York Times. So my columns appeared on Wednesday for since 1995. And what that means is I get the first column after every election, because our elections are all held on Tuesdays. So, so I've been used to having to, write the morning out, be the first, get the first shot, when a president is elected or governor or whatever. So when Trump was running against Hillary Clinton in 2016, I wrote 3 columns that night in a space of 2 hours. The first was tilted slightly that Mrs. Clinton was going to win. The second was neutral. And the third was that Trump won. And I wrote 3 columns in the space of 2 hours. But they all began with the same quote. And it was a quote from a friend of mine from Zimbabwe, Leslie Goldwasser, who said that, now an American immigrant, who said, you Americans kick around your country like it's a football. But it's actually not a football. It's a Fabergé egg. You can actually drop it and you can break it. And you have to be from a country that's been broken to appreciate that. And right now we're kicking around our country on the assumption that we can just do this blithely and nothing will happen. When you start kicking around truth and trust, you're really kicking around the crown jewels of the country, and that's what we're doing.
Super. Let's so I'm going to we're going to. I had time for a couple of questions from the audience, but let's the top question we have on our list here is about climate change, which again I appreciate because we spend much too little time in debates like this talking about it. I mean, Rana, you mentioned it. Danny, I don't know if you want to come in as well. I mean, the future of globalization is going to be driven by very different forces from the past of globalization, and climate is perhaps the most significant long-term change. So how do we think about that as we look to the future?
Can I just start by just reacting to something that you said, and I think it was such an important commentary, and I very much appreciated that. And as somebody who's originally from Michigan, I was surprised to see it turn red. It's always been traditionally blue, but I'll be there over the holidays, so we'll see where the wind blows. So I very much appreciated those comments, so thank you, Tom, for that. But let me, I guess on climate, from our perspective, it's definitely an issue and it's a concern for us. We have a mandate that we have to, focus our investments on climate as well. And, I would just like to share that it also presents an opportunity for people to invest. We launched a report a couple of years ago where we saw that, if we looked at, I think it was 21 emerging economies, and if they were to meet their obligations as per the Paris Climate Accord, what would that mean in terms of investment opportunities for private capital? And we defined a $23 trillion investment opportunity, 16 trillion just in Asia. And so obviously for us this is very important because it impacts food supply, it impacts infrastructure, it impacts well-being, in many different ways, and we're seeing it play out particularly in the poorer countries. And we're trying to find ways in which we can, help address that by bringing in sort of private sector solutions. For example, we're looking at things that like disaster resilient housing, right? So if we take, instead of that aid money that comes in after a disaster happens, can we bring it in up front, work with, sort of private developers, create disaster resilient housing, which will then enable these homes to be better insured and therefore become more resilient. So rather than bringing the aid after the fact, bring it up in a much more strategic manner. So we try to see how we can turn it a little bit on its head to create opportunities, but it's definitely something that I think is very important. Just one thing, we were talking about globalization, de-globalization. One thing we have seen, and you'll see if you read the World Bank report, is that increased trade obviously increases emissions. So it's not always everything a net positive. And so then you have to, then I go back to the comment that I made, then it becomes important for the role of governments. Policies are very important, right? How do you address these things to affect some of the disruptions and impacts that are caused by increased trade and globalization, something that we would advocate, but as what Professor Kuan was saying, it's not always a net positive, it's not linear. So how do you create more linear out of the dislinear? And that's where we think sort of role of good policy comes into play.
Danny?
It seems to me that we're at risk of conflating a number of different issues. And the danger is just because they have the word global in them, we think they're all the same bundle of things. There's globalization, which has to do with connectivity, collaboration, trade, and then there's global climate change, global public goods, global institutions. And we lump all these together and we think that they're the same challenge. I want to suggest that they're not, that we can make a lot of progress on global technologies, global exchange, and we could be completely hopeless on global climate change. Here, I think the response that's needed to address the question, what's the world's future, is that humanity needs to change its way of life. It's not that we're at risk of extinction, but we cannot live life the same way that we do now. We need to find different ways to adapt. And that is as much a local response as it is a global one. We don't necessarily think of the global policy being able to fix the way in which our attitudes towards use of disposables, use of plastic bags, use of convenience items, that latter, it seems to me, is what needs to change. The provision of global public goods is an important problem. It is an important challenge, but we need to, again, dissociate that from the globalization phenomenon itself. And part of the problem is that the world has operated so well over the last 7 decades with a unipolar structure centered on America as the leader of the world. It solved all these problems and it pushed globalization. And our muscle memory is the solution must take the same form. Who is now going to be the leader of the world? Well, let's separate these things. If America decides to go a little bit autarkic, we will need to come up with some other institutions that will solve global problems, that will provide global public goods. And a lot of the provision of global public goods are not large military footprint ones. What's needed are clever ideas, a judicious application of technologies, all of which small states and middle powers can play a hugely important role. So I would say, huge problem, let's get the top minds to work on this, and if we have to ditch the current global order, let's do that.
Okay. Now, I was going to take some questions from the floor, but the clock behind us is against us, and I know that we have Sri Mulyani, the Indonesian finance minister, coming in half an hour, and you also want to have lunch. So let me ask Tom for a kind of final thought. So apologies for those who wanted to not ask through the app. I mean, you wrote a book, Hot, Flat, and Crowded. You have talked about climate as a function of globalization. Do you want to sort of say a word on that and respond to Danny, and then we'll close?
Well, I think Danny hit on a really central point, which is that we have a whole set of issues that require global governance, but we have no global government. And the challenge of how you manage those, climate being the central one, but I think electronic currency is going to be another, all of these that are, because the technology is driving them, cross-border. So how do we get global governance on these issues? That takes me back to US and China. The people forget the Paris Climate Agreement was preceded by 4 bilateral agreements between the US and China, and then one by the US and India. So it was really them working together. And that's why I think that's the critical. On climate, James, I would just say that, climate change is a scale problem. If you don't have scale, you have a hobby. Like hobbies, I used to build model airplanes. I wouldn't try to change the climate as a hobby. And so for me, my just sort of broadest way of thinking about this is that I think there's only one thing bigger than Mother Nature, and that is Father Greed, the marketplace. And the only way you're going to be able to get scale on climate is if you reshape the market with the right rules and incentives and laws to produce clean, green, and efficient technologies at scale. And there are 4 in particular. My teacher and friend Hal Harvey talks about the 4 zeros. Zero waste manufacturing, net zero energy buildings, zero emission transportation, and zero emission power. And I think what California has done around SB 100, which is their law that says California as a state will have zero emissions power by 2045, and then creates a step ladder of metrics of how you get there and tells the market, you can do it any way you want, whatever technologies you want, but you will be there. That I think that's the way to attack this problem, that incentivize the market, the greatest engine of innovation and scaling we have to change it. Because I love things like the Paris Climate Agreement. They're all wonderful as aspirational goals. But at the end of the day, I think we don't need a space race right now. We need an Earth race. How do we set up a race where China and America are racing to produce the most clean, green technologies that give us the 4 zeros?
Terrific. That was a wonderful introduction to our Ideas Festival in at the deep end, far from the shallows now. So thank you very much to Tom, Rana, and Danny. Much appreciated.